Hey everybody, it's Ryan. It's Sunday morning and we wanted biscuits and sausage gravy for breakfast. I'm going to go ahead and show you how I put that together. Now this is only enough biscuits for two people. It's only going to make two, maybe three biscuits. First thing you're going to want to do is preheat your oven to 450 degrees Fahrenheit. Next, you see we have all of our ingredients for biscuits out here in front of us, starting with 1 cup all-purpose flour. Now, I personally prefer the bleached flour for this recipe as opposed to unbleached flour. Next up, we have 3 tablespoons of butter. Now, obviously, I have 4 tablespoons sitting there on the counter, but we're only going to use 3 of them. Save that last tablespoon of butter. We're going to use it in the gravy later on. This is unsalted butter. If you have salted butter, you may choose to use a little bit less salt in your biscuits than I do. Next, we have 2 teaspoons of kosher salt. If you're using regular table salt, you might try to use less salt. Maybe try 1 teaspoon instead of 2 because plain table salt is more dense than kosher salt. So the same volume of plain salt will be quote unquote saltier than the same volume of kosher salt. Next, we have 1 teaspoon of sugar, 1.5 teaspoons of baking powder, and finally 1/2 of a cup of milk. You can use all whole milk or all buttermilk. What I personally like to do is to use 1/4 cup of buttermilk and 1/4 cup of whole milk. So half milk, half buttermilk. I think that brings the best of both worlds. All right, now we're mixing all of our dry ingredients together in the bowl. The cup of flour, the salt, the sugar, the teaspoon and a half of baking powder. Whisk all those dry ingredients together. Then set that aside and reach for your butter. Your butter should be very cold, straight out of the refrigerator. I'm cutting 1 tablespoon off, leaving 3 tablespoons remaining. Now you want to cut your butter into small pieces. You don't have to cut them into triangles the way that I am. You can cut them into cubes or rectangles or any shape you want. Just try to get them pretty small, about the same size as what I'm doing here. As you cut them, you can dump them into the flour, the dry ingredients. Next, reach in there with your hand, your clean hand that's just been washed, and squeeze each little piece of butter. Squeeze it between your fingertips until they're flat. Do that to each piece of butter. Now, I learned this technique from a guy named Ken Click. However, I've also heard of other people freezing the butter and then grating the butter with a cheese grater to make little slivers of butter with a cheese grater. You can also use a biscuit cutter, old-fashioned biscuit cutter like Grandma used to do. You could even do this in a food processor if you wanted to. However, they all accomplish the same results. I think this way is the easiest and produces a great result. Once that's done, it's time to pour in our milk. You can make a little well in the center for the milk if you want to. However, I typically don't bother. I don't really notice any difference whether I do or don't, so just dump it in there. Next up, it's time to whisk it all together. Here I am using a chopstick to do the whisking. You can also use the back of a wooden spoon. You just, since it's such a small amount and the dough is very, very sticky at this point, use something small to stir with and basically just gently stir that together until you've done basically all you can do. Well, actually, until the milk is all absorbed. You don't want to overmix it. Now clear some space off on your counter, sprinkle some flour onto the countertop, Dump the dough out onto the floured work surface. You want to sprinkle your hands with flour, sprinkle the dough with flour. You don't want to add too much extra flour to the dough, but the dough is still going to be pretty wet at this point. Add just enough flour to the dough so that it doesn't stick. Not too much, just enough. Now you want to fold the dough over in half and gently flatten it again. Add some more flour as it continues to get sticky. Once it gets sticky, add a little bit more flour. Now gently flatten it and then fold it in half again. These folds are what are going to give the biscuits the flaky layers. You can fold it however many times you want. I would advise folding it at least 8 times. So just keep folding, sprinkling flour on it, smashing it down gently, folding it into half. It's very important to be gentle. If you're too rough with the dough, if you smash it too hard, then it'll be dense, it won't rise as much, it won't be as fluffy. Once you've got that sufficiently folded, now I'm going to cut the biscuits with this biscuit cutter thing that I have. It's important that you use something sharp. If you tried to cut the biscuits with, say, the rim of a glass, the dull rim of the glass would actually smash the biscuit dough. It would crimp the layers together, so they wouldn't rise as much. So here's our first cut biscuit. Looks just like that. It should unstick from the table cleanly, but if it doesn't, you can use a bench scraper. I'm going to set it into a cast iron skillet. You could also use a baking sheet if you wanted to. Now I'm going to refold my remaining dough and cut another biscuit. All right, that's 2 biscuits in the pan. As I said before, they should come up cleanly from the countertop. If they don't, use more flour. Now, I already know that this last bit of dough that I have remaining is not going to be quite enough to make a full third biscuit. So this is going to be our remedial biscuit. It still tastes going to taste good though. Now here I am struggling to make it fit. But on the bright side, there's going to be very little waste. So now we have 3 biscuits in the pan. You don't have to butter the pan or grease the pan if you're using a cast iron skillet. There's so much butter in the biscuits already that there's practically zero chance of them sticking. So just stick that whole pan into your preheated 450-degree oven for 15 minutes. Now, while that 15 minutes is going, we're going to make some sausage gravy to go along with the biscuits. So moving over now to the stovetop, I've browned up some breakfast sausage. And the amount of fat that the breakfast sausage is giving me is not really enough to make gravy with, I feel. So I'm going to take that spare tablespoon of butter that we had left over from the biscuits, and I'm going to mix that in to the breakfast sausage. Once the butter is melted, I'm going to mix in 1 tablespoon of flour. Gently scrape the flour around the pan until it's all saturated by the butter. Essentially, you don't want any of the white flour left over. You want it all to be those blonde strands in the bottom of the pan that are bubbling. This is going to thicken our gravy. And once that is cooked for maybe 30 seconds, we're going to start adding in milk. As it's coming up to temperature, add a little pepper, add a bit of salt. Now the thing with gravy is that You kind of have to be patient. It has to come up to temperature gradually. You don't want to overheat it, but it needs to get to a high enough temperature to where all the ingredients get homogeneous and emulsify into each other. If you look closely now at the gravy, you can see that this has sort of a yellow, there's some yellow on top, and I think that's from the butter where it hasn't really dissolved. It hasn't really become one homogeneous mixture yet. And that's because all of it needs to come up to the same temperature. So just be patient, keep gently stirring it, and it will eventually start to thicken. It will start to become more white and lose that yellow sheen to it. And once that happens, once it starts to thicken, probably want to add a little bit more milk. And just keep being patient, patiently stirring, warming it up. This is on medium heat, middle of the road. You don't want to burn it. You just want to heat it up. Sunday morning, we're not in a rush. We're essentially just trying to time it so that the gravy is done at the same time as the biscuits. And speaking of which, the biscuits are done, having baked for 15 minutes. Pulling the cast iron skillet out of the oven. Definitely want to use a towel or pot holder. If you touch that pan, you will deeply regret it. I'm going to scoop them up with a spatula. You can see they have nice golden brown tops. You can see the layers. You can see the bottoms are golden brown, not burnt. Pretty much perfect. I'm going to plate these up and drop that one back in the pan. Including this remedial biscuit, I think I'm going to cut that in half and put one half on each plate. Going back over to the gravy here, we can see that it has thickened up really nicely. It's almost a pure white now that everything is emulsified. We're just about ready to serve. Now, while I'm plating this up, I want to make one additional comment that I forgot to make. Oven times, everybody's oven is different. If you have a convection oven, you might use a slightly lower temperature or a slightly shorter amount of time than what I did on these biscuits. You just have to kind of experiment with your oven and see what makes the perfect biscuit. So there you have it. We're ready to eat these. That's all for today. Tune in next time.